to the stage, Terri Makowski.
Hi. When I was a little girl, I used to be afraid of the dark. I would lay in bed at night, my covers tucked up under my chin, and my eyes desperately searching for something I knew was out to get me. It wasn't so much the darkness itself, but more what I imagined lived there. Most kids know that their monsters hide under their bed or in their closet and never truly show themselves. But I knew where real monsters came from. They simply walked among us, and nobody cared until now. My monster was my uncle. He began sexually assaulting me at an age where most mothers struggle to hold on to their baby's hands for just a little bit longer. But I didn't have a hand to hold, and for the first time, I knew what it was like to feel alone in the world. My mother, overwhelmed with her decision to be a parent, had 4 children before the age of 24, was in a disastrous marriage with my father, and decided one day that she wanted more. And when we came home from school one day, she was gone. And I remember the emptiness that I felt at her abandonment and the struggle to understand why. But my dad was there, and he was great, and he quickly created a new normal for us. This was the 60s, and he could have very easily made us wards of the state, but he didn't. He chose to keep us together. And as a result, we were latchkey kids, which meant we were often home alone a lot, and my uncle knew this. And for me, this was when the sexual assaults began, and they continued for another few years. Despite the assaults, I had 2 older brothers and an older sister, and we ran the streets of Southwest Detroit like we owned them. I would tomboy after my older brothers and their friends, determined to outrun them, outcatch them, and outthrow them. We would fish on the pond at the park in the hot summer sun like the day would never end, or we would cool off with a swim at the park pool. At night, we would play with the other kids outside under the watchful eye of the neighbors while they listened to Ernie Harwell call the play-by-play for the Tigers. And you could hear the game echoing from porch to porch as we bulleted about. 4th of July was the day we all waited for summer. It was a big parade that marched down Verner Highway, and it ended at the park. And the whole community came out, thousands of people, and they would break bread with each other, and they would party till the sun went down and the fireworks lit up the night sky. And while my little family was going through its changes, the city was going through changes of its own. The '67 riots happened, and all the freedom we were accustomed to changed. It ended. And the park became a tent city for the National Guard, and we were relegated to just the playground area. But the soldiers were really great, and they entertained us and tried to alleviate any fears that we might have. It was, to say, a very difficult year for the city and for my family. But then the Tigers won the '68 World Series, and the whole city celebrated. And my dad went out and he bought this big red horn, and we drove us through the neighborhood, and we were tooting that horn out the window. And my little family welcomed that wonderful moment of happiness that moment brought us. And like the city itself, the healing I had hoped for never came. A few more years go by, and now I'm an adolescent girl struggling to come to terms with my body when my monster reappears. And he's helping my dad move some things around the house and whatnot, and now they're out on the front porch and they're chatting it up. My father, who had since remarried, with his wife, and my monster with his. And I'm somehow drawn into this conversation, and I'm not really sure how, but I'm standing there and I'm not hearing what is being said. I just know how much I hate that man, and I want to kill him, or at the very least, do him some great harm. And then my father brings me back into the moment, because my uncle had asked me to make him a sandwich, and I didn't hear him. And my father was like, go ahead, make your uncle a sandwich. As I walked through my house, I remember feeling sick to my stomach. I was overwhelmed with adrenaline, and I was riddled with fear. I remember just, why couldn't this man just go away and leave us alone? And as I'm in the kitchen assembling his sandwich, I remember thinking, would he really attempt to mess with me, with my father just a few hundred feet away? And then I started thinking, well, maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea, because then my dad could catch him and my dad would kill him. But then if my dad did that, would he go to prison, and then what would happen to us? And as I vacillated with all these thoughts and emotions, my monster appeared just like I knew he would. But I stayed focused on the task at hand, and I stayed focused on the task at hand, and I didn't make eye contact with him. And I heard him whisper off from the distance. He asked me if I remember the game that he taught me to play when I was little. And I'm raging with hatred and harm that I want to do to him. And I reluctantly acknowledged him that yes, I did. But I also told him that if he ever came near me again, I would kill him. And when I look back on that moment in my life, I realized I took a piece of myself back, that I wasn't going to let him take all of me. But the damage had already been done. I struggled as a teenager, acting out, running away from home too many times to count. I was labeled the teenage drama queen, creating problems where there weren't, but nobody ever stopped to ask me why. So I started drinking, started doing drugs, and eventually I quit school. I bounced around until the woman I used to babysit for asked me to come and live with her and her family with the stipulation that I go back to school. So I did. It was for the first time in a long time that I felt like I belonged, but more importantly, I felt safe. This was the 70s. It was a very big love fest, a very communal lifestyle, and there were lots of hippie candy drugs to go around for everybody. But there were people from all walks of life, none more broken than myself. And we all really looked out for each other. But it was as if I had this voice, this little voice in the back of my head telling me, be patient, there's more to life, it will come to you. And so I did. Eventually, that lifestyle doesn't come for free and it doesn't last for long, and my little communal family started to crack. Some people delving off deeper into drugs, and others, like myself, wanting more. Then I found out I was pregnant, and I became a mother at the age of 18. I always say that God knows what he's doing because my baby girl was my blessing to move more in a positive direction. I moved out. I enrolled in a clerical training program through LaSalle, and I had my own little job. It was just, and I left all that negativity behind, and unfortunately my daughter's father as well. But for the first time, it was just the two of us, my baby girl and me, and I had a confidence about myself that I had never known before. I started thinking about our future and that maybe having a family wouldn't be a bad thing. But I knew I didn't know how to trust anyone, not even myself, because my experience as a child had riddled me with doubt. But I knew instinctively that I had to rid myself of my uncle's secret and his shame if I ever wanted to learn how to truly trust again. So I decided that I wanted to heal, and I needed to find somebody to talk about it with. But this was 1983, and rape was never talked about. But one day when I was visiting with my aunt, I decided that she was going to be the one. I chose her because at the time we were very close, and I loved and trusted her implicitly. So as we were visiting, we're sitting at her table, drinking coffee, and our children are playing in the other room. And I'm watching her, and she's laughing and talking and chatting it up. And all the while I'm thinking, when will be a good time for me to start my conversation? I was terrified and afraid because I knew that I would be leveling an accusation against her brother that not only was he a rapist, but he was a child rapist. And I didn't know how she would react. But as scared as I was, I held onto my courage, I used my words, and I spoke my truth. I opened with one line. I simply said, Uncle molested me when I was little. And I chose that word, I used that word because that was the word of the day. And of course, if you can imagine, the mood shifted quickly and her face became sullen and her eyes grew dark. I remember her yelling at me, so, like she was 10 years old. You're not the only one, it happened to us all, we just don't talk about it. And she got up and she walked away, and like that, the conversation was over, and we wouldn't speak of it for another 30 years. I was devastated, because what I had hoped would have been an opportunity for me to rid myself of somebody else's secret and shame ended up with me not only holding on to his baggage, but taking on the secret and shame of my family as well. And up until that point in my life, I thought I was his only victim. So some more years go by, or a few weeks go by, and I'm visiting with my mother, and the topic of my uncle comes up. And I realized that my aunt had obviously said something to her about our prior conversation. So she goes on to tell me that my uncle had been accused of raping children before in the past, but that's why whenever he was around, she kept such a close eye on us. And I could see her searching my face for some kind of validation that the story I now know my aunt told her wasn't true, but it never came. I had to remind her, I simply said to her, well, you didn't do that great of a job. I had to remind her of the time that she left her husband, abandoned her children, and moved across the country to California to start a new life. And she kind of pushed back, and the conversation wasn't going anywhere, and I realized that I just gathered up my baby girl, and we left. But that had such a profound impact on me in how I would raise my daughter. When I was a teenager, I never saw myself as being married with a family. I wanted to move to New York and be a writer. I had a pretty good voice, and I thought I could make something of it. But up until that moment in my life, every choice up until that moment in my life was made for me. I didn't ask to be a girl born in this man's world. I didn't ask for my mother to leave. I didn't ask my father to leave us alone as much as he had to because he was our only provider, and I didn't ask to be raped. There were people and circumstances that made those decisions for me. So I decided that I was going to be honest with my daughter, and I was always going to tell her the truth. The first thing I wanted to do was to teach her how to make a decision. So I started small. Do you want to wear this outfit, or do you want to wear this outfit? And I would let her choose. Do you want this for breakfast, or do you want that for breakfast? And I knew on some level I was empowering her with every option. Some more years go by, and as she grows up, I tell her about my rape and who my monster was. I teach her that her body is her body, that no means no, not maybe or 5 minutes later, but it means fucking no right now. I want to give her everything that I wanted as a girl growing up. And so I gave her knowledge through my truth. I gave her strength and courage through my story. I gave her a sense of wonder that the world was so much bigger than she would ever imagine, and that what we are our sister's keeper, and what happens to one happens to us all. I gave her a voice, so when she walks out into this world, she doesn't have to take what is being dished out. She knew she had choices, and she was responsible for those choices, good or bad. But I was still aching inside, and I realized I still needed to heal. I was very confident in the young woman that I had raised, and it was if in a way that I was raising myself all over again. So I decided I'm going to embark on another journey of healing, and I make a plan. I didn't think that I just had to speak to one person about it. So I made a plan, and I had 3 goals in mind. The first was I wanted to learn how to love myself, because I realized that if I didn't know how to love myself and what I brought to the table, how would I identify it when somebody else did? I wanted to organize my emotional closet because I was very reactive, and I wanted to understand where these feelings were coming from. And then third, I wanted to get him off the streets. So I got to work. So I started with 3 words: I love myself. And I said them every morning and every night and any time in between when I could think about it. To say the struggle was real, it's an understatement. I was a 33-year-old mother of a teenage girl, and I hated everything about myself. And so I realized that I had to understand. In time, I came to believe those words, that I am good and that I am worthy and that I do deserve all the abundance that life does have to offer, like love and happiness and prosperity. I had to understand that my journey of healing was a recovery like any other, and that I was going to have good days and I was going to have bad days, and I had to be okay with those bad days. And once I understood what that was all about, I called down to the county sheriff's office in the county that my uncle lived in down in Ohio. I gave him his name, I told him what city he lived in, and I shared my story. At this point in my life, I'm an experienced legal secretary, and I understand that there are statute of limitations in reporting rape. I know that this was a rape that happened in Michigan and not in Ohio. And as I tried to explain to the deputy on the other line that you have a predator in your community and I can promise you he is raping as we talk, they blew me off. And so I had to realize that I wasn't going to fight, I wasn't going to win every battle, and I had to let it go. But that was another 10 years that that man was free to rape, and he did. He eventually went to prison after he gave his last 5-year-old victim herpes. So we fast forward a few more years, and some of my cousins and I reconnect, and we start talking about forming a family reunion. And everybody's got this good vibe going on, and I hear from my cousin that her mother, my aunt from 30 years ago, is very upset with me trying to organize this event. So I reach out to her. And like 30 years before, she starts yelling at me, "Why are you doing this? This is going to upset your grandmother." And then she got to the meat of the matter. "Your uncle has a right to come down here and see his mother." And there it was. We didn't know that he had just been paroled a few weeks before. And like everything else in our family, we tiptoed around the fact that this man was a monster and everybody shrouded him. But I wasn't that insecure young woman I was 30 years before. I had a voice and I used it, and we had words. And I told her in no uncertain terms, "Will you ever silence me again?" And I told her they are all responsible for what happened to us as children. So I know there's some side effects from the things that I've experienced. I know that I suffer from PTSD with deep roots linked to my childhood, and I'm okay with that. I have to be. That was another decision that was made without my permission. But I understand now what I'm going through, and sometimes I still have a darkness come over me, and I'm not afraid what's in that darkness now. I know what's in it, and it's my fear, it's my anxiety, it's my doubt, it's my shame, and I'm okay with that. But as I started my journey, I created a mantra that I learned when I was that little girl tomboying through the streets after my brothers in Southwest Detroit, and that is, everything is going to be all right. Everything is going to be okay. Thank you.
Terri Makowski, ladies and gentlemen. Everything is all right.